Hello everyone, and welcome back for another FFG Live. We're here today for a sort of impromptu stream. At least on your guys' side, we've been planning to do this stream for a little while, but we didn't know exactly when PQs would wrap up due to some of the rescheduling. But I'm here. I'm your host, Xander Tabler, Community Manager here at FFG, and I'm joined by lead game designer, Danny Schaefer.
Hey, how's it going, everyone?
All right, so as mentioned, we really wanted to sit down and talk about Planetary Qualifiers and things that we've seen now that they're wrapped up for the season. So set 2 is done. We're moving to set 3. I know a lot of people had a really good time at pre-releases this weekend, it seemed like. And I'm really excited for everybody to get hands on the set fully this coming weekend. I don't know about you, but I'm
really looking forward to it. I think there's a ton of exciting stuff in Twilight Republic for people to really dig into and start building decks with.
Awesome.
Yeah.
But before we get fully into talking Twilight Republic and what that means for the game, we want to chat a little bit about what PQs looked like and some of the things that we saw. As mentioned, we've been watching very closely all season. Some of our team was on site at some of these events, which is really cool. I'm hoping to get to some myself in the next season. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I would love to.
And so we wanted to talk about what do we see during the Planetary Qualifiers for set 2. Obviously, there's some things that everyone has seen, but let's talk about some of the decks that we saw, topping some of these events and top 8s and winning them.
Yeah. So obviously we know, Boba Fett was doing really well in a lot of events, but beyond that we saw a pretty diverse tier 2, right? We saw Sabine, we saw Rey coming on really strong at a point, Kira and Bosk on the more controlling side.
Yeah.
And then both of the Han Solos actually performing quite well across all the PQs. So that was cool.
Love Han Solo, so I was excited to see.
Huge fan of both of them.
Both of them, doing well. And like you said, Sabine, there was a couple different options you could kind of go with Sabine too, with Sabine yellow, Sabine green.
The green ones were I think putting up the most results, but I think yellow also has some legs.
Yeah, I definitely saw a couple of the Sabine yellows, which was cool to see. I really enjoy that deck, so I'm glad to see it going well. And then there were some more like rogue decks, some of the ones that we didn't really anticipate just based on the amount of hype around them and what people were talking about with them. So it was kind of cool to see some of these other ones. I know personally the one I was most surprised by and have now started to try to build is the Tarkin yellow.
Yeah, that's a really cool deck.
It's a really cool deck, and there's not that much that changes obviously with set 3 because there's not
a lot of Imperials
in set 3, so it doesn't really change much. But I thought it was a really cool deck, and I know they got top 8s a couple different places.
Yeah, I saw a handful of those. I saw one Gar Saxon yellow, which is pretty exciting, and then a few Cad Banes floating around. A few Palpatines as well, which Palpatine I think does get a lot from Twilight Republic.
Oh yeah, Palpatine.
Get those token battle droids to throw away for his ability.
Yeah, so it's just basically paying 1, drawing 1, dealing a damage feels great at that point. Yeah. And then there's also Krennic and Iden on the kind of the control side. Not a huge control showing.
I think Kira was the blue villain leader doing the most, but Krennic and Iden still have some showings for sure.
Yeah, I was really happy with all of those decks, and I immediately was looking through the deck list, seeing what I was like, okay, can I build some of these with all the decks I already currently built without taking any apart? And I know some people, like I was talking, Tarkin Yellow beat me with that at Spiel, so I was like, oh, this is going to do some things as well.
Yeah, sometimes they just get a lurking tie with 4 experience, and you're like, oh no, what am I going to do?
Yeah, what are you going to do? And so, I mean, besides all the surprises that we talked about and some of the decks that we saw in that tier 2, you said, there was one leader that pretty much showed out more than anybody else across the spectrum too.
Yeah, of course. So Boba Fett from set 1, collecting the bounty, was huge. More than 40% of top 8 decks had Boba Fett as the leader. And almost 60%, more than 55% at least, of the winning deck lists were Boba Fett.
Yeah.
And we did see it, as you mentioned, across all the colors. I think the yellow and green versions were the best, but red versions came on really strong, especially the last couple weeks. And there were even, I think, maybe 5 or so blue Boba Fett lists that also made top 8.
Yeah, Boba Blue was popping up. I mean, it's been around since early set 2 and even set 1 a little bit. So saw that coming out a little bit more later in the season, which was interesting.
So really, every single possible color you could play him with was succeeding.
Yeah, and so I know that we have planned the stream and we said that there would be a little bit of information that we're going to talk about besides just, hey, what did we see out there? Was a change of pace for going into Twilight Republic. And so I think these results you can tell possibly by the chat or the other groups that you've seen, but we have an announcement today regarding Boba Fett.
So the announcement today is that effective this Friday, November 8th, with the release of Twilight of the Republic, Boba Fett will be suspended from Premiere. What this means is that Boba Fett will not be legal to play as a leader in any Premier events, whether the casual weekly play events or the competitive PQs, sectors, regionals, etc. We can talk a little bit about what suspended means. Basically, it's he is not legal, but we will regularly check in on the metagame we'll be doing something like this, a live stream, an article, at least once per set, kind of working around the competitive seasons, where we'll be looking at the list and seeing, is there anything else that should be suspended? We hopefully will not have to suspend things too often, but also reevaluating and seeing maybe in the future there's a spot where we feel like it's safe for Boba Fett to come back.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the moment, for the time being, no Boba Fett.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate a couple of those points that you said.
Yeah.
And that it is clearly we are doing this suspension because it is not healthy for the metagame at this point.
Yeah.
But again, we are using the word suspension very, very specifically because there's always the chance that this card can come back. At some point, we decide that like maybe he won't dominate the metagame as much, and it feels like a safe place to bring a card back if it is off the suspension list. And
yeah.
So,
yeah, we talked a lot about the terminology and the way we wanted to frame this, and we talked honestly about the possibility of you just say he's banned, and we thought this struck the right tone of there is a realistic possibility at some point, not in the immediate future, but at some point we could revisit this, and there's a shot that we'll take an honest look and he could come back, but gone for now.
Yes. And like we said, we will be checking into the competitive meta as well as the casual meta pretty regularly going forward. Our cadence will likely be sometime before Planetary Qualifiers each set, and as well as afterwards, closer to the release of the next set, we'll do a more deep dive into it, where we can sit down and talk about if anything is adding to the list, anything coming off the list, and that'll be our point where we get to check in with all of you and talk about what we're seeing on the inside from here. What the results are looking like, what's exciting, what is like, hey, this is something that we're not liking seeing, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I expect that most of the time this update will be probably no changes to suspensions, just here's what we're seeing, here's what we like, here's what we're watching. But at times there would also be the opportunity to potentially add or remove something from suspension.
Yeah, we just want to give you all the opportunity to know exactly when we will be coming to talk to you all about this. We obviously, if something happens and we need to talk to you all sooner or different times, that could possibly happen. But we want to give you all a nice cadence that you can expect for each set going forward. And we're really thinking about how this affects the competitive scene, obviously, with Planetary Qualifiers, and in the future, sectors, regionals, and galactics.
Yep, absolutely.
And again, before we get some more questions about it, this is just for Premier Play. I want to make sure that's reiterated. At casual competitive, like you said, if you're playing at your kitchen table, do what you want. That's up to you.
And Twin Suns, you can still play Boba Fett. When the reprint of Spark of Rebellion hits and you're playing draft or sealed, also, of course, you can still play Boba Fett if you get him in draft or sealed.
Oh, and I will be.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think we explained what suspension is, what people can expect from that. But let's talk a little bit about why now. Why are we suspending Boba Fett at this exact moment?
Yeah. So as we discussed, the Planetary Qualifier results came in, and they were it was incredibly dominant. 40% of top eights, more than 55% of winners is well above the level that we're comfortable with for a single leader. And it, again, was across multiple different colors of bases. It's just, we don't want a metagame that is that dominated by one deck. As far as the specific timing, we wanted to do it now so that people could really dive into Twilight of the Republic with the release, start building decks with those cards, and know that for the next season of Planetary Qualifiers, for the ones coming up in January, February, that they could start now planning, knowing what the metagame would look like without the specter of Boba Fett hanging over their heads.
Exactly. This is going to be a fresh start for those who are not interested in playing Boba Fett, but wanting to see what this new meta can bring. And I'm really excited to see what people come up with, especially in those mid-range areas, and maybe even with specifically cunning and villainy that maybe they felt locked out of because Boba Fett was very dominant in that space. Yeah.
One thing we talked a lot about is that we think you will still be able to play these sort of mid-range yellow villain, or even yellow-green villain, yellow-red villain type of decks, just with more of a variety of leaders. You won't have to play Boba Fett because he's so powerful. Maybe there's a Cad Bane comes up a little bit. Maybe Jango Fett from Twilight of the Republic. Or maybe, a lot of possible leaders I think now can get a new look because Boba Fett is gone.
Yeah. And so I see this a little bit in the chat already, and I know this is going to be a big question. So why Boba Fett specifically? There's so many different options. You said you didn't want to go, or we are doing suspension, but why him and why not maybe a supporting card or a cast of supporting cards?
Right. So we, basically any possible option, we talked through pretty extensively on the design development team. And we did talk a lot about, okay, are there support pieces that we can suspend while leaving Boba Fett himself legal? Ultimately, the conclusion that we came to was that Boba Fett himself was the biggest problem. He is a really big outlier in terms of power level. and it's exacerbated because he is a leader. Leaders have a sort of a special place in Star Wars Unlimited where they define archetypes. A deck can only ever have one, and you have access to it every single game.
Yeah.
Because of that, Boba Fett being so much more powerful than comparable leaders at the same deploy point, the same style, was just doing more to force out other options to restrict diversity in the metagame than any other single card really could. And especially because he doesn't really ask anything specific of your deck building. It would be one thing if like a Harrison Dula was really good, where you have to build a really specific deck around her.
Yeah.
Boba Fett is just, things leave play, ready resources. That's always going to be good.
Yeah.
So we felt like Boba Fett himself was the biggest issue. If we were going to suspend support pieces, it probably would have had to be multiple cards. And there's a real risk, even if we did that Boba would continue to be the best leader option, even with those cards gone, and we'd have to suspend even more cards to keep him in check in the future.
Yeah. And so I think this brings us to a good point of, suspending a bunch of cards is obviously not ideal, but was there anything that you all talked about on the design team before going with suspension rather than an errata, a restricted list, all these other ideas, and how did you land on suspension being the perfect place for us?
Yeah, great question. And we did talk through all of those options. Errata was something we talked about. Some kind of restricted list where either you're limited in copies or limited in what cards you can play together. Some kind of leaders retire when they hit a certain number of tournament results. Ultimately, the reason we felt like suspension was the clear choice is because, one, it's very clean and easy to understand. It's just this card is not legal.
Yep.
It's minimal, and that, again, if you have a restricted list or if you have some of these other options, you might have to have a bigger list of cards.
Yeah.
And it might be harder to even understand what's legal. It gets kind of unwieldy. And it's very timely. Like, we can act, again, right now, as soon as we see the Planetary Qualifier results.
Yeah.
Some of these other, like the leader retirement process might take a while. You might have to live with Boba Fett for longer. And there was potentially an overlap with our rotation system, which we have not talked about in detail yet, but Premier will rotate eventually. And that's really the main way we want to keep things fresh and keep the metagame changing. With suspensions as a tool to deal with problematic cards. We did talk also about just saying outright ban, but we felt like suspension was more accurate to the way we were thinking about it, to the fact that we will take an honest look from regularly and see if it's safe for these cards to return to the metagame.
Yeah, it's never a one and done thing.
Yeah.
There's cards that are more or less likely over time based on what you all are doing on the development side, but it's never completely out of the picture and that card is gone forever.
Yeah, and I should speak also to errata specifically, to just changing the text or changing the numbers on the card. We really do not feel good about functionally changing a card, changing its power level in that way, because it does put a real burden on players, and especially the more casual players who aren't necessarily fully plugged in to just know that a card does something different than what it says, especially in a physical card game, where the card you're looking at has different text than what's actually true about the card.
Yeah.
It's a real burden. It can get hard to remember, hard to keep track of, especially if you do it often. So we felt like suspension was the clean, timely answer that the metagame needs.
Yeah, I think you mentioned about it, the erratas. This is kind of guided by the idea that we've had behind the entire game, which is that this is easy for a newcomer to show up, be able to pick up and play, difficult to master in the long run, and erratas don't play into that same idea of what is a core principle of how you're building this game community.
Exactly. We want it to be very simple. Just you can't play Boba Fett as your leader now.
Yep. Or play Twin Suns. Twin Suns is
in Premier,
Yeah, for sure. And so I think on top of all of this, it's important for us to talk about why Boba Fett ended up in the exact spot that we are in currently. And I think that's just something we could give a little bit of insight into from the behind-the-scenes lens, because I know that's something that people are very curious about.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is, we should mention also, there's going to be an article talking about this where I'm going to dive into even more detail than we get into here. But I can start by just kind of stating the obvious. Boba Fett was a development mistake. If we knew then what we know now, we never would have printed him with the deploy costs, the stats, and the ability that he has. Really, honestly, what happened is in the first set of the game was a time of a lot of uncertainty, right? We're developing the game with no pre-established baselines. We're building the baselines for how good leaders can be. And that means there's a lot of moving parts. There were stretches where all leaders kind of had these type of stats, where Sabine was a 2.7 and Luke was a 4.9, I think.
Yeah.
And we adjusted as we went, and for a lot of that stretch, when everyone else was much better, Boba Fett was fine. He was kind of a normal average leader. Obviously, we realized by the time we got late into testing, oh, Boba Fett has really good stats compared to other leaders. Are we okay with this? But we didn't, at the time, have necessarily the evidence from past play testing to show that he was really good. And there was, I mean, I'll be honest, there was a lot of debate. Like, is it okay to release a leader with these stats? But we felt in the end, we felt like it was worth the risk to push boundaries with him. In retrospect, that was the wrong call. We pushed him too far. And now, again, the baselines are better established. Our development team understands better to avoid cards like Boba Fett that are that generically good. And I think going forward, we will have a better handle on this kind of thing.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
All right. And again, I think you lead us right into our next point that we want to talk about is what to expect going forward. Like we mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be doing regular check-ins with you and the rest of the design team on a set-by-set basis, multiple times a set, to kind of talk about what we're seeing in the meta, how things are performing, where we're expecting things to go, and how we feel about all of that. And so that's going to be important for us to do on a very regular cadence. So you'll likely see that pop up in streams, and we'll likely do at least one article per set release talking about where things are at from your point of view. And that'll be one that, it either adds things, removes things, or does nothing to the suspension list. Ideal is nothing gets added or eventually something gets removed from the suspended list. But we are not saying that something will change each time. We just want to give you all that time where you can expect us to come in and say, hey, here's where we're at, and be ready to go from there.
Yeah, exactly. We want to be communicating with you as the players as much as possible, let you know where our thought process is at. And again, we don't anticipate having to suspend things super often, we're hoping, but if we need to, we'll obviously be watching, and we will take action if and when it's called for.
Love it. All right. And so just to give people a little more background, in the idea of suspending cards, what is something that people can expect, or what would make people expect to see a suspension in the future? What are some of those guiding principles you all are using when you make these decisions?
So there's a few things we'll look at. One is what we really talked about with Boba Fett already, that level of dominance, especially in competitive tournaments, where, again, 40% of top eights, more than 55% of winners, is just really above the line of what's acceptable for a single leader archetype to be doing.
Yeah.
So that'll be the main factor, honestly. We will also factor in time. If something is dominant for an extended period of time, it'll be more likely for us to take action than if it's just if something has a few good weeks and then the metagame has a chance to adjust. We want to give players time to respond and try to target the top decks. But if we see the same deck doing really well time and time and time again, we'll be more likely to step in. And then there's also, we will factor in the play pattern, right? If there's, I don't think there's anything really like this right now in the world, but you can imagine a situation where there's maybe some kind of combo deck that's hard to interact with, that is winning in a way that doesn't even necessarily feel like you're playing a game of Star Wars Unlimited, where we might be willing to take action even if it wasn't quite at the same threshold of dominance that we talked about.
Fair. That seems very reasonable. And so I know that we talked about this a little bit, but this is not a decision that we made, overnight. We just decided to wake up this morning and you were like, hey, let's make this stream happen. This is something we've been talking about and thinking about and monitoring for the entire set of PQs and before that too.
Absolutely.
And so I know that people, I'm sure, are worried about, okay, what does this mean going forward? Does removing Boba Fett, this piece in the puzzle, does it mean that something else takes over immediately and all of a sudden we have another problem and this is a cascading effect? Or have you all, I know that we did some testing.
Yeah. So, as you said, from the first PQ results we saw, we were talking about it because even from the start, Boba was looking really strong. And we spent a lot of time analyzing within the team, discussing, and also, play testing potential future metagames, future decks. We're, of course, well aware that there are other decks and cards out there putting a lot of pressure on the metagame. Probably the most obvious are the aggressive Sabine Wren decks that certain decks have a really rough matchup into, and especially with Energy Conversion Lab, which also, huge player in the metagame.
Yeah.
within our analysis, our testing, we felt like the tools are out there, and especially with Twilight of the Republic coming out and adding even more tools and even more options, the tools are there for players to deal with those decks, that if they rise to the top, that people will be able to target them.
Yeah.
It's possible, again, maybe presumably they'll still be among the best decks, but that they won't just come in and take Boba Fett's place.
Exactly.
Again, we'll of course keep watching, but we do think the tools are there for the meta to shift and be healthy with Twilight coming out.
Yeah, plenty of mid-range decks. We were running through so many games.
Yeah, we ran a lot of mid-range into Sabine in the last few weeks, and felt like both that there are some new decks that could come out that could do really well into her,
for sure.
And also that a lot of existing archetypes, if they're not also trying to deal with Boba Fett, can bring in some tools, can adapt, can target her more directly, and really shore up that matchup.
Yeah. And so we're really excited to see what you all come up with in the future when it comes to figuring out how to beat Sabine or some of these other decks that are going to pop up as Boba leaves the premier meta. And so we're excited to see what you all can come up with. The creativity is some of the most fun parts of this game, is figuring out how to go around some of these problems. And we hope this opens things up for a whole new lane of people to do that.
Absolutely. We really think y'all are going to be able to come up with some really cool stuff with Twilight of the Republic. And we also, with Jump to Lightspeed and Legends of the Force coming as the next two sets after that, we think both of those will really shake things up again, provide a lot of really cool options and excitement in the metagame. So really, really looking forward to it.
Oh yeah, there's going to be some really fun stuff coming up with those. And I'm really excited to talk about them in the future. But I believe that's what we have for today. Thank you all for joining us. As Danny mentioned, there is a full article that he and the design team wrote up on our website. It is live now. So head on over there and check it out. And it has basically what we've shared today, as well as maybe some other things that we forgot to mention here. But it goes into all of the topics around why Boba Fett. And it also lists, again, the date is this Friday, November 8th. So thank you all for joining us today. And we'll see you all next time.